Welcome to the Booktopia podcast. I'm Ben Hunter, Booktopia's fiction category manager, and this is a podcast about books and the people who read them and write them and love them. And today's podcast is a special one. I say that often, but I'm very excited about today's guest. Nikki Gemmell is the author of over a dozen novels and half a dozen books for children and some non-fiction, including her most recent work, After. Nikki is an international bestseller, and her books have been translated into 22 languages. Her new novel is called The Ripping Tree. Nikki, it is a pleasure to have you with us.
It's lovely to be here, Ben. Thank you.
It's been a long time. How you been?
No, it has been a long time. This latest book has taken me 10 years. I've been busy and life has just crashed into everything. I've lost both my parents. That was traumatic. I had another baby. So it's like I always tried to finish this book and then everything else happened.
A lot of life happened.
Yeah, I got diverted into non-fiction and children's fiction, but this one wouldn't let me go.
Oh, I'm glad we have it finally. So it's called The Ripping Tree, and it's published by Fourth Estate, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. And Nikki, HarperCollins, the sales team there, they do this Herculean job where the sales guys come out and they have to talk to all the book retailers like me, and they have to explain dozens upon dozens of books in very quick succession. And they sort of started explaining this new Nikki Gemmell book, and it was going to arrive before Mother's Day, and it was about a shipwrecked woman in colonial Sydney. And I'm thinking, yes, this ticks all the boxes of
Excellent.
Great women's fiction. But then as soon as I spent any time with it, it became something else entirely. It's something far more deceiving and unsettling. And you can get that from its glorious cover, which we've been talking about, and its intriguing grab line or strap line, "Get out before they save you." What are we in for with this thing?
Well, I wanted to write, I love challenging myself, and I'm a restless writer. And with this one, I wanted to write a thriller, a page turner. But as with a lot of my writing, I like asking difficult questions too. So floating around the ripping tree was things like Henry James, The Turn of the Screw, the film Get Out, which is like a stranger in a strange land, and they have to escape an environment that's alien to them, that they think initially is very friendly and inviting, and then realise that it's actually threatening their life. So that was the premise of The Ripping Tree too. It's a woman who's shipwrecked in colonial times. She's the only survivor. It could be colonial Sydney, but it could be, the coast of Tasmania or WA. That is unspecified, but basically she comes to this a big illustrious house through the help of an Indigenous man. She arrives in the midst of this family, and initially she's like, this is fabulous, wow, I'm saved. And then gradually it's like the walls and the claustrophobia close in on her to the point where it's like she has to get out, or, she might lose her life or her sanity. So, I wanted to write a thriller that was very unsettling, that also is provocative, because a lot of my work, fiction and non-fiction, has been very provocative. I've had a ball, but it's taken me a while to get here.
It certainly has. Let's start with this woman who goes by names.
She's Thomasina, and then her nickname is Poss.
Exactly. Yeah. And she's on the cusp of womanhood. Mm-hmm. She's an orphan girl. She's shipwrecked. She has the chance to make a new life for herself. And she brings this new perspective into this colonial place. It's got all these tropes almost of what, for lack of better language, we would just call historical women's fiction, a woman's story. Is that something that you're writing self-consciously and trying to subvert? Because it's not it's not a wonderful romance is this thing? It's the shit happens, Nikki.
Yeah. It does. You're allowed to swear.
Yeah.
Yeah, the book is about a woman finding her voice or losing her voice because of circumstances around her. It's political fiction as well.
Yeah.
I'm interested in power dynamics, and I've always been interested in female confidence and how women gain confidence, how women lose confidence. I've always been interested in writing very, very honestly, and because I think honesty connects, and I can still do that through historical fiction. So I wanted to write about a protagonist who is very relatable, in a very honest way. I wanted to write about her, and I wanted to write a heartbreaking story as well, in terms of this book. But there's optimism and light there too.
Yeah, it's got it all. Tell me about the family she encounters, because they are some interesting people. Maybe start with the mother.
Yeah. So this is a family of all boys. And I can relate to this in a way because I have 3 sons. And I also eventually got a daughter, but there was a yearning within that world, my beautiful boys, to balance out the family somehow. So I took that to the nth degree in terms of a mother who is desperate for a daughter after having all these sons. And then this young woman, this 16-year-old, arrives on her doorstep. And this is an older woman who sees kind of someone, almost like a Pygmalion story, someone to mould. And it's how that can go very, very wrong when 2 strong females clash and come up against each other, and each is trying to establish dominance over each other. So I was interested in her. This is basically a family that is at the dark heart of Australia. And, there's a lot of questions being raised now about, our Indigenous past, the brutality at the heart of our Indigenous past. I wanted to dive straight in there. This is a family with, a veneer of respectability. Everyone in the wider world looks up to them. They're very illustrious, very successful, but it's like, how did they make their money, and what's the secret at the heart of that beautiful house that they live in?
Yeah, and the people with it. I also think of this as a book about the loss of innocence.
Yes.
Particularly with the youngest son.
Yes.
Mouse.
Mouse, the little boy who's about 6 or 7, yeah. There's all these things going on around him which he doesn't really understand, but this is a thriller. There is a dark secret at the heart of this family, and I don't want to do spoilers here. Mouse is at the centre of this secret and this world. And it's how traumas can kind of reverberate through generations, and how they can damage people, in terms of what Mouse has perceived, what his parents have done, what his older siblings have done, how it impacts upon that tiny little boy and that tiny little body. It's, I wanted to write something challenging in terms of Australian fiction. I wanted to maybe lull readers in terms of, it is a thriller, it's an historical thriller, it is perhaps all those tropes, but then go bang underneath. There's something much darker and unsettling that, I hope provokes questions about, land and ownership and control and power, all those kind of things.
And how our illustrious colonial history comes to be.
Yes.
I think especially with this boy, the heartbreak of this novel sets in, because there's so much joy and so much wonder from which the main character, Poss, she milks that out of him. And he kind of breathes life back into her after being shipwrecked and completely abandoned. And you see that corruption in real time. Did you Did you look at your own sons when you were crafting these boys and then destroying them?
I didn't want to completely destroy them. Funnily enough, I did look at the beautiful wonder and innocence of my own youngest little boy, who's just got this big, wide open heart and is so tender and so affectionate. And as a mother, you want to preserve that. It's so beautiful, and you want to make that flower. And I see, that in my older boys, they went through dark periods of their adolescence, but now I've got them back. They've come back. And so I wanted to capture that in fiction, that the beauty of the soul of a young boy, that wide open innocence. I wanted to explore that, and also the lovely way he has of relating with other people and with someone who he sees as a playmate too. A young woman. This is a lonely boy who's out in the middle of whoop whoop, doesn't have other young kids around him. He wants a playmate, and he sees someone who he can draw into his magical world. And then the person that he's drawn into his world suddenly starts backing away and going, whoa, there's something deeper and darker underneath all this. And the little boy is desperate to retain them. So I wanted that tension within the book as well.
Tension is the word for it. Okay, so how do you approach writing a novel about colonial Australia? As a white author, and you're writing about white characters, the British colonisers, who are having their own experiences and interpretations of Indigenous Australia, the original Australians. How do you approach that?
Well, first of all, I knew I absolutely could not write from the perspective of an Indigenous Australian at all. And I guess in the epilogue, there's a woman talking about an earlier part of her life. And she says in that epilogue, in terms of Indigenous Australia or Aboriginal Australia, or the natives as she called it in those days, which was the term then, I absolutely respect, but I do not understand. And that was the position that she took as the protagonist, narrator of the story. And that was the position I took too. I absolutely respect, I'm fascinated by, but it's not my story to tell from their perspective. And I had a wonderful sensitivity reading by John Maynard, Professor John Maynard, who's up at the University of Newcastle. And he was great. He loved the book. He suggested a few tweaks. I loved the back and forth between us because I was just all ears. I was just drinking up his suggestions, what he was saying, things to tweak, things to remove, things to add. He gave me ideas for Indigenous names. I loved all of that. I felt like I was learning so much as I was writing. And in fact, with all my writing, my non-fiction as well as my fiction, my columns, I write a weekly column as well. I write to understand. I write, I ask questions. It's like, but how does that work? I need to know more about this. I need to understand. And that's where everything begins with me in terms of my fiction and my non-fiction. So I was writing this story of colonial Australia, a story of survival. I was writing once again to understand.
And when you approach that, how do you avoid anachronism, or do you just accept that it's part of the journey, and that you emphasize the fiction in historical fiction?
How do you mean about do I avoid like cliche or
bringing a 21st century mindset to a book that is set in another time?
Yeah, well, it's hard because you've got a modern sensibility to it. But I think what I do with all my fiction, because some of my kids' fiction has been historical too, you write from a perspective of honesty, of what feels like an authentic experience. And so with whatever I do, whether it's set now, whether it's set, 200 years in the past, I always think, does this ring true?
Yeah.
Does this feel authentic? And so that's my tuning fork for my fiction and also my non-fiction, for everything I write. Is this true? Is this honest?
And in addition to the sensitivity reading, which sounds brilliant, what other things did you do to research this book or to immerse yourself in the kind of place you wanted to write about?
Well, I went down to Tasmania, I went up to Macquarie, I went to places where there's still a heavy convict presence. I went out to St Albans and the Hawkesbury. I immersed myself in those places. I stayed in, old sandstone courthouses. I visited old colonial mansions just to get, what it was like to see how tall the ceilings were. Or in the case of an old colonial courthouse I stayed in, notice little things like a watch house or a jailhouse, the doors to the cells were so narrow because people just weren't larger. They weren't obese.
Yeah.
And so, it was like the doors could be much, much narrower than, what they are now. Just little things like that. Or I slept in a swag in front of a wide colonial hearth, and it was like, just the breadth of that fire, that was like, that informed my book, because there's a few scenes in The Ripping Tree that's set in a colonial kitchen and things like that. I did a lot of reading about shipwrecks, accounts of shipwrecks or convict times. I researched colonial menus, because there's a few scenes set in a dining room in The Ripping Tree. So it's like, well, what would they be eating? So I went back, and discovered food and meals that I didn't even know what that meant. But, it's all in the book, basically.
That's terrific. Okay, so what do we want to achieve with this novel? You mentioned provoking or ruffling the feathers of your readers.
Yes.
What are you trying to provoke?
Well, I guess mainly what I want to achieve is that I want it to be a page turner that people feel like they can't put down, and hopefully stay up all night wanting to finish it and
Happy to second that.
and wanting to find out, if Poss escapes and how does she escape and what happens and does she discover the heart, the horror at the heart of this family? Does she find out what really happened there all those years ago? And then around that, I just want to achieve a book that stays with people in terms of they may think about Australia and its past in a different way, or a fuller way, or a more honest way. I want this book to provoke questions, which is what I guess I've wanted with so much of my fiction, from The Bride Stripped Bare through to After, through to, my first novel, Shiver. It was all about getting people to question what they think they know. So I'm still continuing on that path. My book after this one is a journey again. It's always different. I feel like every book I write is a reaction to the previous one. But that's the joy of being a writer, in a way.
I love that. I love it so much.
I feel so fortunate.
Oh, we're fortunate to have you. Can we talk about After for a second?
Sure.
So that was your last book before this. It's a work of non-fiction. It's this very honest and moving memoir of the death of your mother and its aftermath. And that raised challenging questions about the taboo of end-of-life care and death and euthanasia, assisted dying, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
It got a lot of attention. I remember you did Australian Story. There were a lot of tearful interviews, and it all looked utterly exhausting for you, I'm sure. Now we've moved all these years on.
Yes.
I can only imagine. I wonder about all the readers you've reached with that and the conversations you've had, and how does it feel to have a few years between yourself and that book now?
I feel like it's always a privilege to communicate with my readers. It always feels like, wow, it's so humbling that I've moved people in some way, or that they feel compelled to respond in some way. And so many people with After had their own stories about suicide, that they'd been family suicide. There's stories about euthanasia. Or there's stories about really complex mother-daughter relationships.
Yeah.
Estrangement, or, mothers they hadn't spoken to for years and then they've found a way back into the relationship. People just wanted to talk after that book. And I was all ears, and I feel so grateful for the journey all those readers took me on, because it helped me through the whole process. Because once again, I wrote that book to find answers, like, why did my mother suicide? What was her journey with euthanasia and end of life? Just to recap, she was a great supporter of Philip Nitschke. She'd been communicating with him. She suicided after she had chronic pain, felt like there was no way out. The only way out was to end her life because there were no euthanasia laws in her jurisdiction then. But she didn't tell us. She didn't tell us, her family, her children, her 3 children, what she was doing. So it was an enormous shock, and I basically wrote that book to understand what on earth had gone on. There was a police investigation. I was interviewed. Initially I was under suspicion for aiding my mother's death. So it was an enormous process to go through. It's like 5-6 years down the track now. I'm out the other side. Finally it feels like an incredible lightness of being, and part of that process was just writing the book and getting all the really heartfelt, compassionate responses to it. It really helped me through. But I feel now I've put that away. It's a chapter of my life I haven't closed, but I've perhaps put it on a bookshelf.
That's beautiful. I feel like I've asked so many hard questions. I'm gonna finish off with some light and fluffy ones.
Sure.
So, quick round. What was the last book you read and adored?
Oh, look, I loved, because I don't read many books now because I find I'm writing so much, and I'm writing my weekly column, and I don't want other people's writing to bleed into my style. So I really just read poetry a lot now. That's my tuning fork because I love beauty in writing. But the last novel that I wrote that I absolutely adored, Shuggie Bain, the Booker winner, it was just completely transported by that world and the muscularity and the beauty of that prose.
Do you have a particular place where you write, or a particular time of day at which you write?
Well, look, I haven't for years.
Right.
For decades, I have just written everywhere and anywhere. Basically, I've written 3 books in Starbucks. I wrote 1 book in a private members club in London that I was fortunate enough to have a membership of, and I could just sit there with a pot of tea for like 3 or 4 hours. Basically, ever since I've been a mum for 20 years now, those 6 hours between school drop-off and school pick-up, that is sacred to me. They are my hours where I just go for it with my laptop wherever I am. In fact, I've come from a meeting this morning. I had 3 hours to fill before I came here to Booktopia. Once again, I just sat in a cafe with my laptop, and I'm just thinking, oh my God, where is my laptop? I hope it's out there. It's got my new novel in it.
Well, make sure it's there before you leave.
Oh my God! Yeah, I've just left my backpack with my laptop in it somewhere. Oh no, I've got an indication that it's out there. So yeah, I have been used to writing everywhere, but amazingly, my eldest has gone to Melbourne to university, which is not the city I live in. All the kids have shuffled round the bedrooms. I finally, at the grand old age of 54, have a room of my own.
Oh.
It has taken me decades. And I will say it's just a sliver of a veranda that's glassed in, but that's where I write.
Does the trick.
Oh, after decades of writing in cafes and wherever I could and finding plugs and running out of power and chargers and jostling with people to get the desk by the plug and the charger, I finally have my own space to write in, and it feels glorious, except all the other kids are now crashing into it all the time to do their homework and because they love mummy's sanctuary. But anyway, it's all good.
Bless them. Do you have one person to whom you trust to read your writing before anyone else?
Yeah, and that's a big one for me because I think writing is all about confidence, and your confidence can be so easily destroyed. And particularly when I was younger, I can remember sending my first novel, Shiver, off to an agent, and they rejected it. And I thought, that's it. That's the end of my career. I'm never going to be a writer. It was devastating for me. And it was only another female writer, I can say Helen Razor at Triple J. We were both working at Triple J back in the day. And she said, Nikki, how ridiculous just, taking one person's opinion on board with your manuscript. Send your manuscript, Shiva, to my publisher, Jane Porphyriman at Random House, and see what she says. And lo and behold, Jane took it in 24 hours. And I think, it is all about finding the reader you can trust, finding your champion. What one person hates in this industry, another person will love. And so for me, I've been very careful as I've progressed through the writing years to find people who aren't going to break my confidence. And the main person for me is my agent. He's an ex-publisher. And he's great. With some of my books, he's read them and then he's called me into his office. This is when I used to live in London. And he sat me down with pages and pages of notes. But basically he said, that protagonist doesn't work, or the ending doesn't work, or change, tweak the main male character, or whatever it is. It doesn't ring true, whatever. And, sometimes I've taken a manuscript away for another 6 months or so and worked on his suggestions.
Out of one meeting.
Yeah,
Wow.
Because basically, he would sit me down for several hours with pages of notes, and I would sit opposite him and take down notes and then go back. And if he said change the ending, then that may take me 6 months to change the ending. But I trust him, and so I usually do it.
When you finally do have a finished manuscript and you send it off and it's accepted and it's all done and in ink, how do you celebrate?
Oh my God, it's weird. I think I never celebrated as much as my first novel, Shiva, because just the sweetness of getting that box of books arrive, opening the box, and then seeing your finished novel. I can remember just stroking the cover of that book and just kind of inhaling it, just, holding it up to my face, wanting to kiss it, because it was the culmination of a dream that for so many years. I was 30 when that novel was published. I never thought I'd be so lucky enough to have a novel published. I still must admit, I still get like that because every book of mine feels like a risk. Writing is still risky for me. I'm still daring and trying new things and challenging myself and challenging the reader. I'm still like, oh my God, I'm still being published. There's still the wonder and the gratitude for that. So, it was amazing the first time round. With The Ripping Tree, I will probably celebrate with, a block of Top Deck chocolate or something. But it'll still feel great and I'll be very grateful.
And after all these years, what's the nicest thing someone said about your writing?
Gosh. Just that they finished the book.
Oh, gosh.
It sounds ridiculous, but my lovely, lovely, wonderful tutor, I did a master's in creative writing at UTS in Sydney, and I was so fortunate to have the legendary Glenda Adams, who won the Booker, the Miles Franklin with Dancing on Coral. And she said to me one day, Nikki, the hardest thing is to get the reader to turn the page. And so I've always thought of that. It's very, very true. You're taking the reader on a journey with you and it's so easy for them to just toss the book aside and think, oh no, I can't be bothered. It's just going to lie on the bedside table. And I've got like 8 or 10 books stacked on the bedside table, on my bedside table. I always do. So many of them I don't finish, or I'll get around to them or whatever. So I think if someone says to me that they've finished the book, it's like, oh, wow, that's wonderful. They took that time to go with me. It's like I hold out my hand to them as a writer, and they took that hand as a reader, and they went along for the journey with me. So that's always the best thing that's ever been said to me.
Well, if you're still listening, I recommend you go for the journey of The Ripping Tree, because it's a ripping read. It really is. Nikki, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you, Ben. That was lovely. I really appreciate it.
The Ripping Tree is published by Fourth Estate and is available now from booktopia.com.au.
Thank you for listening to the Booktopia podcast channel. Don't forget, you can subscribe to us on SoundCloud and iTunes for free and get access to hundreds of author discussions, book analysis pieces and more. Or, if your eyes need a workout, head to Booktopia TV on YouTube. Don't forget, for all books featured in this podcast, and for access to a whole bunch of other fun content on our blog, head to Booktopia, Australia's local bookstore, at booktopia.com.au.